My brother stole my medical school acceptance letter to take my place. 20 years later, the truth came out during his malpractice trial. I was 17 when everything started falling apart, though I didn't know it at the time. My twin brother and I had always been competitive, but it was the kind of rivalry that pushed us both to excel. We studied together, took the same AP classes, and both dreamed of following in our father's footsteps into medicine. The difference was that I actually had the grades and test scores to back up those dreams, while he spent more time partying and barely scraped by with C's and B- averages. The morning the acceptance letter arrived, I was at my part-time job at the local grocery store, stocking shelves and counting down the hours until I could get home to check the mail. I'd applied to 12 medical schools, but this one was my top choice, a prestigious program that would have set me up for exactly the kind of career I'd been planning since I was 12 years old. My hands were shaking as I drove home, knowing that thick envelope could change everything. But when I got home, there was nothing. My brother was sprawled on the couch watching TV, looking unusually relaxed for someone who should have been just as nervous about college admissions as I was. When I asked if any mail had come, he just shrugged and said nothing important had arrived. I spent the next 3 days checking the mailbox obsessively, calling the admissions office to confirm my address, and slowly watching my dreams crumble as thin rejection letters started trickling in from other schools. The rejection hit me harder than anything I'd ever experienced. I'd been so confident, so sure that my grades and volunteer work at the hospital would guarantee acceptance somewhere decent. Instead, I found myself scrambling to find any college that would take me, eventually settling for a state school with a mediocre pre-med program. My brother, meanwhile, somehow managed to get into that same prestigious medical school I'd been dreaming about, despite his average grades and complete lack of meaningful extracurriculars. Everyone was shocked by his acceptance, but he played it off like he'd been working harder than anyone realized. Our parents were thrilled, especially our father, who kept bragging about how his son was going to be carrying on the family tradition. I tried to be happy for him, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. The school had waitlisted students with better credentials than his, yet somehow he'd gotten a full acceptance with scholarship money. The next 4 years were brutal for me. I watched my brother coast through medical school while I struggled to maintain my grades and find research opportunities at a school that barely had the resources to compete. He'd come home during breaks with stories about his prestigious clinical rotations and the connections he was making, while I was working extra shifts at the hospital just to pay for textbooks and application fees for medical school. I applied to medical school 3 times and got rejected each time. The competition was fierce, and my undergraduate school's reputation wasn't helping. My advisors kept telling me to consider other healthcare fields, maybe nursing or physical therapy, but I couldn't give up on the dream that had been driving me since childhood. My brother, meanwhile, graduated with honors and landed a competitive residency at a top hospital. By the time I was 25, I'd given up on medicine entirely. I'd spent years trying to prove myself worthy of a field that seemed determined to keep me out, and I was exhausted from the constant rejection. I ended up taking a job in medical device sales, figuring it was the closest I'd ever get to the career I'd originally wanted. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was selling equipment to the kinds of specialists I'd dreamed of becoming. My brother's career took off exactly as everyone expected. He specialized in cardiology and built a successful practice, married a fellow physician, and seemed to have everything I'd ever wanted. Family gatherings became increasingly difficult as everyone celebrated his achievements, while I struggled to explain why I'd ended up in sales instead of surgery. I started avoiding holidays and making excuses not to visit, unable to handle the constant reminders of what my life should have been. The resentment grew slowly, like a cancer that I couldn't quite identify until it had spread through every aspect of my relationship with my family. I found myself angry at my brother's success, angry at my parents for their obvious favoritism, and angry at myself for not being able to let go of something that had happened so long ago. I knew my feelings were irrational, but I couldn't shake the conviction that something fundamental had been stolen from me. I was 32 when I met my wife at a medical conference where I was demonstrating new surgical equipment. She was finishing her residency in emergency medicine, and we bonded over our shared understanding of the medical field, though from very different perspectives. She knew about my failed attempts to get into medical school, but she never made me feel like I'd settled for less or given up too easily. Our relationship helped me find some peace with the path my life had taken. I was successful in my own right, made good money, and had found someone who understood both my ambitions and my disappointments. We got married 2 years later, and I started to believe that maybe everything had worked out the way it was supposed to. Maybe I'd been meant for a different kind of life all along. But that peace was shattered when my brother's malpractice case hit the news. A patient had died during what should have been a routine procedure, and the family was claiming gross negligence. Initially, I felt terrible for him, despite our complicated relationship. Malpractice suits are a nightmare for any physician, and I knew how devastating false accusations could be to someone's career and reputation. The details that emerged during the trial were shocking. It wasn't just one mistake or one moment of poor judgment. The prosecution painted a picture of a physician who'd been cutting corners for years, falsifying patient records, and performing procedures he wasn't qualified to handle. Multiple former colleagues came forward with stories of near misses and concerning behavior that had been covered up or ignored. I was following the case obsessively, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because I couldn't believe the brother I'd grown up with could be capable of such reckless behavior. The man being described in court seemed like a complete stranger, someone who'd never developed the ethical foundation that should be at the core of medical practice. I found myself wondering how someone could go through years of medical training and emerge so fundamentally unprepared for the responsibility. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced evidence about his medical school application. They'd subpoenaed his academic records as part of building their case about his fitness to practice, and what they found sent shockwaves through the courtroom. His original application had been rejected. He'd never actually been accepted to medical school through the normal admissions process. Instead, he'd somehow obtained and submitted someone else's acceptance letter and credentials. The prosecution had traced the fraud back to the very beginning of his medical career, showing that he'd built his entire professional life on a foundation of lies and stolen identity. The someone else, according to the records, had been his twin brother, me. I was sitting in my office when my wife called to tell me about the news coverage. She'd been watching the trial online and had seen my name mentioned in connection with the fraud. For a moment, I couldn't process what she was telling me. 20 years of believing I wasn't good enough, 20 years of thinking I'd failed on my own merits, and it had all been a lie. The acceptance letter I'd never received had been stolen from my mailbox before I even knew it existed. My brother had used my credentials, my test scores, and my volunteer work to get into medical school, then somehow managed to maintain the deception throughout his entire career. Every achievement he'd claimed, every accolade he'd received, had been built on the foundation of opportunity that had rightfully belonged to me. The rage that hit me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just anger about the lost opportunity, though that was devastating enough. It was the realization that I'd spent 2 decades blaming myself for failures that had never actually been mine. I'd internalized the belief that I wasn't smart enough, wasn't dedicated enough, wasn't worthy of the career I'd wanted, and all of that self-doubt had been based on a deliberate deception. The legal implications were staggering. The medical school launched their own investigation and discovered that their records had been tampered with decades earlier. The hospital where my brother had done his residency found evidence of falsified recommendations and forged transcripts. Every institution he'd been associated with had to review their procedures and figure out how such massive fraud had gone undetected for so long. But the personal implications were even more devastating. I had to confront the fact that my own brother had been willing to destroy my future to advance his own career. He'd watched me struggle through rejection after rejection, had seen me give up on my dreams, and had never once considered confessing what he'd done. He'd attended my wedding, had been at family gatherings where I was treated as the less successful sibling, and had maintained his deception through it all. The media attention was overwhelming. My name was suddenly connected to one of the biggest medical fraud cases in decades, and reporters were calling constantly to get my side of the story. I found myself having to relive the worst period of my life in front of cameras and microphones, explaining how I'd felt when I thought I wasn't good enough for medical school, how I'd rebuilt my life around different ambitions. My parents were destroyed by the revelation. They'd spent 20 years being proud of their son's medical career, bragging about his achievements to their friends and colleagues. Now they had to confront the fact that everything they'd celebrated had been built on fraud, and that their other son had been the real victim of the situation. The guilt and shame were eating them alive, and they didn't know how to begin making amends. The hardest part was realizing that it was too late to reclaim the life I should have had. I was 37 years old, established in a different career, with a wife and financial obligations that made starting over impossible. The medical school offered to honor my original acceptance, but I'd been out of science for too long to jump back in at that level. The window for the life I'd originally planned had closed permanently. My brother's conviction was swift and decisive. He was sentenced to prison for fraud, lost his medical license permanently, and faced civil suits from dozens of patients and their families. His wife divorced him, his assets were seized to pay damages, and he became a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough background checks in professional licensing. The fall from grace was complete and irreversible. But vindication didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. I'd spent so many years imagining what it would feel like to prove that I'd been wronged, to show everyone that I'd been capable of success all along. Instead, I just felt empty and cheated out of 2 decades of the life I should have lived. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with grief for all the opportunities that could never be recovered. The strangest part was how everyone suddenly wanted to treat me like a victim who deserved sympathy and support. Colleagues who'd never taken my medical knowledge seriously suddenly wanted to hear my opinions on clinical matters. Family members who'd always seemed to prefer my brother's company started reaching out more frequently, trying to make up for years of perceived slights. I found myself in the surreal position of being famous for something I'd never actually accomplished. People knew my name because I'd been accepted to medical school 20 years earlier, not because of anything I'd achieved in my actual career. It was a hollow kind of recognition that reminded me daily of the path I'd been forced to abandon. The financial compensation from the various lawsuits was substantial, but it couldn't buy back the years I'd lost or the career I'd never had. I donated most of it to scholarship funds for students from backgrounds similar to mine, hoping to help others avoid the kind of obstacles I'd faced. It felt like the most meaningful way to honor the dreams I'd had to give up. My relationship with my wife became my anchor during this period. She'd fallen in love with who I'd become, not who I might have been, and she helped me process the complex emotions that came with learning the truth about my past. We talked for hours about whether to try to have the life we'd been denied, whether it was worth disrupting our established happiness to chase opportunities that might no longer exist. I started volunteering at free clinics, using my sales experience and medical knowledge to help organize equipment donations and coordinate with healthcare providers. It gave me a way to contribute to patient care without having to completely restart my education, and it satisfied some of the calling I'd felt toward medicine since childhood. It wasn't the career I'd planned, but it was meaningful work that used both my professional skills and my personal understanding of the healthcare system. The most unexpected consequence was how the story changed my relationship with failure and success. I'd spent so many years believing that my rejections from medical school reflected some fundamental inadequacy on my part, some lack of intelligence or dedication that made me unworthy of the career I wanted. Learning that I'd actually been accepted, that my credentials had been good enough all along, forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about my own capabilities. I realized that I'd been carrying shame and self-doubt that had never been justified, that I'd limited my ambitions in other areas because I'd internalized the belief that I wasn't capable of achieving at the highest levels. The revelation was liberating in some ways, but it also made me angry about all the opportunities I'd passed up because I'd been convinced I wasn't good enough. The trial coverage led to several documentary and book deals, people wanting to tell the story of how medical fraud had destroyed 2 lives in different ways. I turned down most of them, not wanting to become a professional victim or to profit from the tragedy that had derailed my original plans. But I did participate in one documentary about fraud in professional licensing, hoping to help prevent similar situations for other people. My brother sent letters from prison, trying to explain his actions and ask for forgiveness. He claimed he'd been young and panicked, that he'd never intended for the deception to go on so long or to cause so much damage. He said he'd tried to confess multiple times over the years, but had been too afraid of the consequences to follow through. I never responded to any of his letters, not because I couldn't forgive him, but because I had nothing to say that would change anything. The hardest part of the whole experience was accepting that some things can't be fixed or made right. I could never get back the 20 years I'd spent believing I wasn't good enough, never reclaim the career I'd been meant to have, never undo the damage that had been done to my self-concept and my relationship with my family. All I could do was try to build something meaningful from the life I actually had, rather than mourning the life I'd been denied. 5 years after the trial, I started a nonprofit organization focused on helping non-traditional students navigate the medical school application process. We provide tutoring, mentorship, and financial support for people who are trying to change careers or overcome obstacles in their educational background. It's given me a way to use my experience, both the success I'd achieved in medical sales and the struggles I'd faced trying to get into medicine, to help others avoid some of the pitfalls I'd encountered. Working with pre-med students has been both rewarding and painful. I see so much of my younger self in their determination and anxiety, their desperate hope that their hard work will be enough to earn them a spot in medical school. I try to help them understand that rejection doesn't reflect their worth as people, that there are many paths to meaningful careers in healthcare, and that sometimes the obstacles we face lead us to opportunities we never would have discovered otherwise. The organization has helped dozens of students gain acceptance to medical school, and several have already graduated and begun their residencies. Watching them achieve the dreams I'd had to abandon has been bittersweet, but mostly it's been fulfilling to know that my experience, as painful as it was, has been able to help others avoid similar struggles. It's given me a sense of purpose that I never found in medical device sales, a feeling that I'm contributing to something larger than my own success. I still wonder sometimes what my life would have been like if I'd been able to follow my original plan. Would I have been a good physician? Would I have specialized in the same field as my brother, or would I have found a different path within medicine? Would I have been happy with the demands and stresses of medical practice, or would I have discovered that my romanticized view of the profession didn't match the reality? But those questions don't torment me the way they used to. I've learned to see my actual life as valuable on its own terms, not as a consolation prize for the life I'd been denied. My work with the nonprofit has shown me that there are many ways to serve others and make a difference, that the specific title or profession matters less than the commitment to helping people and solving problems. My relationship with my parents has slowly healed, though it will never be the same as it was before. They've had to confront their own role in the situation, the way they'd favored my brother's apparent success without questioning how he'd achieved it. We've all had to learn to live with the knowledge that our family was built on a lie, that the person we'd celebrated and admired had been a fraud from the very beginning. The most important thing I've learned is that identity isn't just about what you do for work or which schools you attended. It's about how you respond to challenges, how you treat other people, and what you choose to do with the opportunities you're given. My brother had every advantage I'd been denied, and he used them to hurt people and build a career on deception. I was forced to find a different path, but I've tried to use my experience to help others and to contribute something positive to the world. The story still gets media attention occasionally, especially when there are other high-profile cases of professional fraud or when medical licensing boards implement new verification procedures. I've become an accidental expert on the topic, someone reporters call when they need a personal perspective on how fraud affects not just patients and institutions, but also the family members who get caught up in the deception. Looking back, I can see how the experience changed me in ways that might actually have been beneficial. I developed resilience and humility that I might not have gained if my original plans had worked out smoothly. I learned to find value in unexpected places, to see setbacks as opportunities to explore different directions rather than as permanent failures. I became more compassionate toward people who are struggling, more aware of how circumstances beyond our control can shape our lives in fundamental ways. The nonprofit work has connected me with other people who have had to rebuild their lives after major setbacks or disappointments. We share an understanding of how disorienting it can be to have your assumptions about yourself and your future turned upside down, how hard it is to find new sources of meaning and purpose when your original plans fall through. But we also share the knowledge that it's possible to create something valuable from the pieces of a broken dream. I've never regretted turning down the offers to write a book or make a movie about my experience. The story belongs to me, but it's not the most important thing about me. I'm not defined by what my brother stole from me or by the injustice I suffered. I'm defined by what I chose to do with the life I actually have, by the people I've helped and the problems I've solved and the relationships I've built. My marriage has been the constant through all of this upheaval. My wife has seen me at my angriest and most devastated, has helped me work through the complex emotions that came with learning the truth about my past, and has supported me as I've tried to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my original plans. She's reminded me that the life we've created together is valuable regardless of how it compares to the life I might have had. The final twist in this whole saga came just last year, When one of the students in our mentorship program was accepted to the same medical school my brother had attended using my credentials. She's brilliant and dedicated, exactly the kind of person who should be practicing medicine, and watching her receive that acceptance letter brought everything full circle for me. She's living the dream I'd had to give up, but she's earning it honestly, and she'll use her training to help people rather than to build a career on fraud. When I congratulated her on her acceptance, she thanked me for helping her believe she was capable of achieving her goals even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. She said my story had shown her that setbacks don't define your potential, that there are always ways to contribute and make a difference even when your original plans don't work out. Hearing that from someone who was about to begin the journey I'd been denied was the closest thing to closure I think I'll ever get. I still think about my brother sometimes, wonder if he's found any peace or purpose in prison, if he's able to live with the knowledge of what he did to me and to his patients. But mostly I try to focus on the future rather than the past, on the work I'm doing now rather than the career I never had. I've learned that justice isn't always about getting back what was taken from you. Sometimes it's about making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. The organization we've built has helped more than 200 students navigate the medical school application process, and our scholarship fund has provided financial support to dozens of students who might not have been able to afford the costs of medical education otherwise. It's not the legacy I'd planned to leave, but it's one I'm proud of, one that reflects the values I'd hoped to bring to medicine even if I never got the chance to practice it myself. In the end, I think the most important lesson from this whole experience is that life rarely follows the script we write for ourselves, but that doesn't mean it can't be meaningful or fulfilling. The challenges we face, even the injustices we suffer, can become the foundation for something valuable if we're willing to look for opportunities to help others and to make a positive difference in the world. My brother stole my acceptance letter, but he couldn't steal my ability to contribute to the field I'd always loved, just in a different way than I'd originally planned.